Detective Sarah Chen stood at the edge of Millbrook Forest, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air. 18 years had passed since she'd last set foot in these woods, 18 years since the case that had haunted her dreams and ultimately drove her away from the small town of Cedar Valley. Now, at 42, she found herself drawn back by a phone call that had shattered the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her past. The morning sun filtered through the amber canopy above, casting dancing shadows across the forest floor that seemed to whisper secrets she'd tried so hard to forget. Sarah adjusted her leather jacket against the chill and checked her phone once more, rereading the message from Deputy Marcus Rivera. "Sarah, you need to see this. The drone footage. We found something near the old Watchtower. It's about Tommy Hartwell." The name alone sent a familiar ache through her chest. 8 years old when he vanished without a trace on a September afternoon in 2006. She had been a rookie detective then, fresh out of the academy and assigned to assist the lead investigator. The case had consumed her for 2 years until the official investigation was quietly closed, filed away as a presumed abduction with no leads. But Sarah had never stopped believing that somewhere in these woods lay the truth about what happened to the bright-eyed boy with the gap-toothed smile. She began walking the familiar trail toward the Watchtower, her footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. The path was overgrown now, nature reclaiming what had once been a well-maintained hiking route. Cedar Valley had never fully recovered from Tommy's disappearance. The tourism that had once sustained the small mountain community dried up as parents became afraid to bring their children to the cursed woods. Businesses closed, families moved away, and those who remained seemed to carry the weight of unspoken secrets. The old fire watchtower emerged through the trees like a monument to forgotten vigilance. Built in the 1950s, the 60-foot steel structure had been abandoned for decades, its wooden cabin at the top weathered gray by countless seasons. Sarah remembered climbing those stairs with the search team, calling Tommy's name until her voice was hoarse, finding nothing but dust and broken glass. Deputy Rivera was waiting at the base of the tower, a tablet in his hands and an expression that mixed excitement with apprehension. At 35, Marcus had been just a teenager when Tommy disappeared, but he'd grown up hearing the stories, understanding that some mysteries cut deeper than others in small towns. "Sarah, thank God you came," Marcus said, his voice tight with barely contained energy. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see this, but I couldn't make sense of it without you." She had worked with Marcus briefly before leaving Cedar Valley, training him during his first year as a deputy. He'd been eager then, still believing that every case could be solved with enough determination. Looking at him now, she could see that idealism had been tempered by experience, but something in his eyes suggested he still held on to hope. "Show me," Sarah said simply. Marcus tapped the tablet screen, and drone footage began to play. The aerial view swept across the forest canopy, the camera's movement smooth and deliberate. "I was running a routine survey for the Forestry Service," he explained. "We've been documenting changes in the woodland for environmental research." But when I reviewed the footage later, the drone's camera zoomed in on an area roughly 50 yards northeast of the Watchtower, where the trees thinned slightly around a small clearing. At first, Sarah saw nothing unusual, just autumn leaves, fallen logs, and scattered rocks. Then Marcus paused the video and pointed to a specific spot on the screen. "Look there, just left of that fallen pine." Sarah squinted at the screen, and her breath caught. Partially obscured by nearly 2 decades of forest growth was something that shouldn't be there, a geometric pattern too regular to be natural. It appeared to be concrete or stone, arranged in what looked like a rectangular outline. "It's hard to make out from up here," Marcus continued, "but there's definitely a structure buried under all that debris." And Sarah, he swiped to the next frame where the camera had captured something that made her heart skip. "There's something else." Among the fallen leaves and forest litter, a small patch of faded blue fabric was visible, partially buried but still recognizable. Sarah's mind immediately flashed to the missing person report she'd memorized years ago. Tommy Hartwell was last seen wearing a blue jacket with yellow trim, jeans, and hiking boots. The forest around them seemed to grow quieter, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. "We need to get up there," Sarah said, her detective instincts overriding the emotional turmoil building in her chest. "But we need to do this right. No contaminating the scene." As they gathered the necessary equipment from Marcus's patrol vehicle, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She'd experienced this sensation 18 years ago during the original search, a persistent awareness that the forest held more secrets than it was ready to reveal. The local indigenous community, the Millbrook tribe, had always maintained that these woods were sacred, that they demanded respect and would protect their secrets from those who came with impure intentions. Sarah had dismissed such beliefs during her younger, more cynical years. Now standing in the shadow of the Watchtower with evidence that might finally provide answers to Tommy's fate, she found herself wondering if there was wisdom in those old warnings. They hiked to the coordinates Marcus had marked on his GPS, moving carefully through undergrowth that hadn't been disturbed by human passage in years. The silence was profound, broken only by their footsteps and the occasional call of a crow high in the canopy. As they approached the clearing, Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced as a rookie detective when she knew she was close to something important. The buried structure was more extensive than the drone footage had revealed. Using hand tools to carefully clear away decades of accumulated forest debris, they uncovered what appeared to be a concrete foundation, roughly 8 feet by 12 feet. The walls extended about 3 feet above ground level, though they had been hidden by soil and vegetation for so long that they seemed more like natural rock formations than human construction. "This isn't on any of the old maps," Marcus said, consulting a folder of historical documents he'd brought. "According to the forestry records, this area has been undeveloped woodland for over a century." Sarah knelt beside the structure, her trained eye taking in details that might prove crucial. The concrete was old but well constructed, with rebar reinforcement visible where weather had eroded the surface. Along the eastern wall, she could make out what looked like the remnants of a doorway, partially collapsed but still recognizable. "It's a bunker," she realized aloud. "Built to last. The question is, who built it and why?" As they worked to clear more of the structure, Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID showed a name she hadn't seen in years: Dr. Eleanor Whitman, the forensic anthropologist who had consulted on Tommy's case. Eleanor had left Cedar Valley around the same time Sarah did, accepting a position with the state crime lab after expressing frustration with what she'd called institutional resistance to finding the truth. "Eleanor?" Sarah answered, stepping away from the excavation site. "Sarah, Marcus Rivera contacted me about the drone footage. I'm driving up from the Capitol now." Eleanor's voice carried the same precision and authority Sarah remembered. "I need to examine that site personally. And Sarah, there's something I never told you about Tommy's case, something I've been carrying for 18 years. The line crackled with static, and Sarah had to strain to hear Eleanor's next words. "I found evidence back then that suggested Tommy's disappearance wasn't random. There were indicators that someone had been preparing for it, planning it. But when I tried to present my findings to Sheriff Harrison, he shut down the investigation. Said there wasn't enough evidence to pursue conspiracy theories." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. Sheriff William Harrison had been a respected figure in Cedar Valley, a man who'd served the community for over 30 years before retiring shortly after Tommy's case was closed. He'd always maintained that they'd done everything possible to find the boy, that sometimes people simply vanished without explanation. "What kind of evidence?" Sarah asked. Soil samples from around the Watchtower showed disturbances that predated Tommy's disappearance by several weeks. Someone had been digging in that area, preparing something. And there were tire tracks from a vehicle that didn't match any of the search and rescue equipment. Professional grade, heavy duty. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Eleanor was right, Tommy's disappearance hadn't been an opportunistic crime or a tragic accident. Someone had planned it, prepared for it, and successfully covered their tracks for nearly 2 decades. "Eleanor, get here as fast as you can," Sarah said, "and bring everything you have from the original case. I think we're about to uncover something that certain people have worked very hard to keep buried." As she ended the call and returned to where Marcus was working, Sarah noticed something that made her pulse quicken. In the soft earth near the bunker's entrance, partially protected from years of weather by an overhanging tree branch, was the clear impression of a boot print. The tread pattern was distinct, and despite the passage of time, it was deep enough to suggest someone heavy had stood there for an extended period. "Marcus," she called softly, not wanting to startle him. "We need to photograph everything before we go any further, and we need to call this in through proper channels." Marcus looked up from where he'd been carefully brushing soil away from what appeared to be a metal object embedded in the concrete. His face was pale, and his hands were trembling slightly. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think you need to see this." She approached carefully, mindful not to disturb the scene. Where Marcus had been working, the corner of a small metal box was now visible, corroded by time, but still intact. Etched into the visible surface was a symbol that made Sarah's blood run cold, the insignia of the Cedar Valley Sheriff's Department. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath as the implications sank in. This wasn't just a hidden bunker where someone had disposed of evidence. This was something far more sinister, a deliberate construction by someone in law enforcement, someone who had used their position and authority to conceal the truth about Tommy Hartwell's fate. Like a detective following breadcrumbs in a dark forest, you find yourself drawn deeper into a mystery that challenges everything you thought you knew about trust and authority. The discovery of that sheriff's insignia changes everything, but it's only the beginning of a truth that runs deeper than anyone imagined. Buried secrets. The metal box came free from the concrete with surprising ease, as if it had been meant to be found eventually. Sarah held it carefully in her gloved hands, noting the weight and the way corrosion had eaten at the edges while leaving the center relatively intact. The sheriff's department insignia was unmistakable, though the metal beneath it bore scratches that suggested someone had tried to file it away at some point. "We can't open this here," Sarah said, though every instinct screamed at her to tear it open immediately. Chain of custody, proper documentation. If this contains what I think it might, we can't give anyone a reason to exclude it from evidence. Marcus nodded, but she could see the internal struggle playing out across his face. He'd grown up in Cedar Valley, had probably known Tommy personally. The need for answers warred with professional protocol, and Sarah understood that battle intimately. They were documenting the bunker's dimensions when Eleanor Whitman's SUV pulled up at the Forest Service Road nearly a quarter-mile away. Even from that distance, Sarah could hear the slam of the vehicle door echoing through the trees. Eleanor had always moved with purpose, but there was an urgency in her approach now that suggested she'd been waiting 18 years for this moment. Dr. Eleanor Whitman emerged through the tree line carrying a field kit that looked like it could outfit a small archaeological expedition. At 58, she moved with the careful efficiency of someone who'd spent decades extracting truth from reluctant earth. Her gray hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her weathered field clothes suggested she'd driven straight from another excavation site. "Show me everything," Eleanor said without preamble, setting down her equipment with practiced precision. As Marcus guided Eleanor through their discoveries, Sarah found herself studying the bunker with fresh eyes. The construction was professional grade, built to withstand decades of weather and concealment. Someone had invested significant time, money, and expertise in creating this hidden space. This wasn't the work of a casual criminal or someone acting on impulse. Eleanor knelt beside the exposed foundation, running her hands over the concrete surfaces with the reverence of someone reading ancient text. "This was built in the late 1980s or early 1990s, she said after examining the materials and construction techniques. The concrete formulation and rebar placement matched techniques that were standard then, but have since been refined. So it predates Tommy's disappearance by at least 15 years, Sarah observed. Which means someone built this long before they needed it, Eleanor continued. This level of planning suggests we're dealing with someone who understood they might need a secure, hidden location at some point in the future. Eleanor's hands paused over an area near the bunker's entrance where the concrete showed different weathering patterns. "Sarah, look at this. These marks aren't from natural erosion." Sarah knelt beside her mentor, noting the subtle differences Eleanor had detected. What she'd initially dismissed as random weathering now revealed itself as something more deliberate. Scratches and gouges in the concrete that formed a pattern. "Someone carved something here," Eleanor said, reaching for a soft brush from her kit. "Help me clear this debris." Working together, they carefully removed 18 years of accumulated soil and organic matter from the marked area. Gradually, letters began to emerge, carved deep enough into the concrete to survive decades of exposure. "TH, I'm sorry." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus stepped back as if the letters might burn him, while Sarah felt the weight of finally having confirmation that Tommy Hartwell's fate was connected to this hidden bunker. But the message raised as many questions as it answered. Who had carved those letters, and why? Was it a confession, an apology, or something else entirely? "There's more," Eleanor said, continuing to work with her brush. Below the initial message, additional text was becoming visible. "Check the tower. Third step from top." Sarah looked up at the fire watchtower looming above them through the trees. She'd climbed those stairs multiple times during the original search, had examined every inch of the cabin at the top. But they'd never paid specific attention to the individual steps, never looked for anything that might be hidden in the structure itself. "I'm going up there," Sarah announced. But Eleanor caught her arm. "Not alone," Eleanor said firmly, "and not without proper safety equipment. That tower is 18 years older than when you last climbed it, and it wasn't exactly stable then." Marcus volunteered to make the climb, being the youngest and most agile of the three. Eleanor outfitted him with a safety harness and radio, while Sarah positioned herself at the base of the tower to maintain visual contact and serve as backup communication. The old steel groaned under Marcus's weight as he ascended, each step accompanied by the protesting sounds of aging metal. The tower swayed slightly in the afternoon breeze, and Sarah found herself holding her breath as Marcus climbed higher. "I'm at the cabin level," Marcus's voice crackled through the radio. "Counting down from the top step now. 1, 2, here's the third step." There was a pause, then, "Sarah, there's something here. The step is hollow underneath and there's a metal container wedged into the support structure. Can you retrieve it safely?" "Working on it now. It's been here a long time, but it's wrapped in plastic. Waterproof." Minutes later, Marcus began his descent, moving even more carefully with the additional burden of the container he'd secured to his safety harness. When he finally reached the ground, all three of them stared at the object he'd recovered. A large plastic bag containing what appeared to be documents, photographs, and several small items wrapped in cloth. "We opened this at the station," Sarah decided, though the temptation to examine the contents immediately was almost overwhelming. With proper witnesses and documentation. But Eleanor was studying the bunker again, her scientific mind processing details that had been nagging at her. "Sarah, I need to show you something else. Something I discovered 18 years ago but was never allowed to pursue." Eleanor pulled out a worn file folder from her equipment bag, its contents meticulously organized despite the passage of time. "These are the soil samples I collected during the original investigation. They showed chemical signatures that were consistent with accelerated decomposition, meaning someone used lime and other compounds to speed up the breakdown of organic material. The concentrations were highest right here, around this bunker. But when I tried to get authorization for a full excavation, Sheriff Harrison said the evidence was circumstantial and the cost of a proper archaeological investigation wasn't justified." Sarah felt a familiar anger building in her chest, the same frustration that had ultimately driven her away from Cedar Valley. "Harrison shut down the investigation just when you were getting close to real answers. There's more," Eleanor continued. "I kept working on my own time using contacts at the state lab to analyze samples I'd collected. The chemical signatures weren't just consistent with accelerated decomposition. They were consistent with someone who knew exactly what compounds to use and in what ratios. This was done by someone with expertise in forensic countermeasures. The implications were staggering. Tommy's disappearance hadn't just been planned. It had been executed by someone with law enforcement or forensic knowledge, someone who understood how investigations worked and how to stay ahead of them. Eleanor's file contained additional photographs, taken during the original search but never included in the official case files. One image in particular caught Sarah's attention, a shot of the area around the watchtower that showed disturbed earth in the exact location where they'd just discovered the bunker. "You photographed the bunker site 18 years ago?" "The disturbance, yes. I documented everything I could, even when I was told it wasn't relevant to the investigation. I had a feeling that someday someone would need this evidence." As the afternoon light began to fade through the forest canopy, Sarah made a decision that she knew would change everything. "We're not just dealing with a cold case anymore. We're dealing with an active cover-up that's been maintained for 18 years. Someone in a position of authority has been protecting the truth about what happened to Tommy, and they're not going to appreciate us digging it up now." Eleanor and Marcus exchanged glances, understanding the gravity of what Sarah was suggesting. They weren't just investigating a missing child case. They were potentially exposing corruption that reached into the highest levels of local law enforcement. "What do you want to do?" Marcus asked. "We document everything, secure all the evidence, and then we contact the state attorney general's office. This is bigger than Cedar Valley now." Sarah looked back at the bunker, then up at the watchtower where more secrets had been hidden. "But first, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." As they prepared to transport the evidence back to town, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice that greeted her was unmistakably familiar and unwelcome. "Detective Chen," the voice said, carrying the same authority it had wielded 18 years ago. "I heard you were back in town, stirring up old ghosts. Sheriff William Harrison, retired for over a decade, but apparently still keeping track of developments in his former jurisdiction." "Sheriff Harrison," Sarah replied, keeping her voice neutral despite the emotions churning in her chest. "I think we need to talk," Harrison continued. "There are things about the Hartwell case that you never understood, things that were kept from you for good reason. Meet me at the old diner on Route 9 tonight at 8. Come alone." The line went dead before Sarah could respond. Eleanor and Marcus had overheard enough of the conversation to understand its significance. The man who had shut down the original investigation was now reaching out, apparently aware that new evidence had been discovered. "You're not going alone," Eleanor said firmly. "He won't talk if he knows you're there," Sarah replied. "But you're right. I need backup. Marcus, can you position yourself somewhere nearby? Stay in radio contact?" The weight of 18 years of unanswered questions pressed down on Sarah's shoulders as they made their way back through the darkening forest. The metal containers they carried might hold the key to understanding what had happened to Tommy Hartwell, but they also represented something more dangerous. Proof that the people entrusted with finding the truth had instead chosen to bury it. When you're standing at the crossroads between justice and conspiracy, every step forward feels like it might be your last. Sarah knew that tonight's meeting with Harrison could either provide the final pieces of the puzzle or put her directly in the path of those who had killed to keep their secrets safe. The confession, the Route 9 diner, had seen better decades. Its chrome fixtures were dulled with age, and the red vinyl booths bore the scars of countless conversations, some of which had probably changed the course of Cedar Valley's history. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a booth near the back that offered a clear view of both entrances and the parking lot beyond the grease-stained windows. Sheriff William Harrison walked through the front door at exactly 8 o'clock, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who'd spent his career controlling situations through presence alone. At 73, he was still imposing. Broad shoulders that hadn't quite yielded to age, and eyes that missed nothing. He wore civilian clothes, but he moved like he was still wearing a badge. "Detective Chen," Harrison said as he slid into the booth across from her. His voice carried the same authoritative tone she remembered, but there was something underneath it now. Weariness, or perhaps resignation. "Just Sarah now," she replied. "I left the department, remember? But you never left the case." Harrison signaled the waitress for coffee, then settled back to study Sarah with the intensity of someone conducting an interrogation. 18 years, and you're still chasing ghosts in those woods. They're not ghosts if they left evidence behind. Harrison's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested her words had hit their mark. He waited until the waitress had delivered his coffee and retreated to a respectful distance before speaking again. "What did you find?" The directness of the question surprised Sarah. She'd expected denials, deflection, perhaps even threats. Instead, Harrison seemed almost relieved that the conversation was finally happening. "You know what we found. The question is why you stopped us from finding it 18 years ago." Harrison stared into his coffee cup as if it might contain absolution. When he finally looked up, Sarah was shocked to see something she'd never associated with the former sheriff: vulnerability. "Because I was protecting my son." The words hung in the air between them, like a confession at a deathbed. Sarah felt her world shift as pieces of a puzzle she'd been working on for nearly 2 decades suddenly rearranged themselves into a pattern she'd never considered. "Your son, Deputy Michael Harrison. He was 26 then, eager to prove himself, hungry for advancement." Harrison's voice carried the weight of a father's worst nightmare. He'd been having problems, drinking, gambling debts, making poor decisions. I thought law enforcement might straighten him out, give him purpose. Sarah's mind raced through her memories of the original investigation. Michael Harrison had been part of the search team, had been one of the deputies who'd helped coordinate the early search efforts around the Watchtower. She remembered him as enthusiastic but inexperienced, someone who'd been given more responsibility than his skills warranted because of his father's position. "What happened to Tommy?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice steady despite the emotions building in her chest. Harrison's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. "Michael was supposed to be on patrol that afternoon, but he'd been drinking. He was driving erratically on the Forest Service road when Tommy appeared, riding his bike on the trail that intersected with the road. Sarah closed her eyes, visualizing the scene. Tommy had been an adventurous kid, always exploring the woods around Cedar Valley. The Forest Service road wasn't officially open to civilian traffic, but local kids had been using it for years as a shortcut between neighborhoods. It was an accident? She asked. The collision, yes. But what happened after? Harrison's voice broke. Michael panicked. Instead of calling for help, instead of trying to save the boy, he put Tommy in his patrol car and drove to that bunker. The bunker you knew about. I built it in 1987, Harrison admitted. During the height of the Cold War, a lot of us thought the world might end. I built it as a family fallout shelter, but we never used it. Never even told anyone it existed except Michael. I'd forgotten about it until he called me that night, hysterical, saying there'd been an accident. Sarah felt sick. Tommy was still alive when Michael brought him to the bunker? Harrison nodded, tears now flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. Michael said the boy was unconscious but breathing. We should have called an ambulance immediately. We should have. He stopped, unable to continue. But you chose to protect your son instead. I was weak. I was a coward. I chose my family over that little boy, and I've lived with that choice every day for 18 years. Harrison's voice was barely audible now. By the time we got Tommy to the hospital, it was too late. The head injury. If we'd acted immediately, he might have survived. The diner around them seemed to fade away as Sarah processed the magnitude of what Harrison was telling her. Tommy Hartwell hadn't been murdered in the conventional sense, but he'd been killed just as surely by negligence, cowardice, and the abuse of power. The cover-up, Sarah said, making it look like an abduction. Michael's idea. He was terrified, not thinking clearly. He said if we made it look like Tommy had simply vanished while hiking, no one would connect it to the patrol car accident. We moved Tommy's body to a location where it would never be found. Then Michael went back and staged evidence to suggest the boy had been taken from the main trail. Sarah remembered the search efforts, how they'd focused on the popular hiking trails rather than the remote Forest Service roads. The investigation had been deliberately misdirected from the beginning. The evidence Eleanor found, the soil disturbances, the chemical signatures. We used lime to accelerate decomposition, Harrison said, his voice hollow. Michael had learned about forensic countermeasures in his training. We thought if we destroyed the physical evidence quickly enough, there would be nothing left to connect us to Tommy's death. But you kept souvenirs. Harrison looked confused, and Sarah realized he didn't know about the metal containers they'd discovered. The box buried in the bunker's foundation, the documents hidden in the Watchtower. Someone else had been documenting what happened. Michael couldn't live with what we'd done, Harrison continued. He started drinking more, became unreliable. 6 months after Tommy's disappearance, he had what appeared to be a single-car accident on Mountain Ridge Road. Drove right off the cliff. Sarah remembered the accident. Deputy Michael Harrison had been responding to a domestic disturbance call when his patrol car had apparently gone off the road during a rainstorm. The investigation had concluded that he'd been driving too fast for conditions, that the accident was a tragic result of his dedication to duty. It wasn't an accident, she realized. Michael left a note, Harrison said. A full confession. Everything we'd done, where we'd hidden Tommy's body, why we'd covered it up. He couldn't live with the guilt anymore. What did you do with the confession? I destroyed it. Even after Michael was gone, I couldn't bear the thought of his memory being destroyed, of my family being destroyed. I convinced myself that bringing the truth to light wouldn't bring Tommy back, that it would only cause more pain. Sarah felt anger building in her chest, but it was tempered by recognition of the human tragedy that had consumed multiple families. You let Tommy's parents live with uncertainty for 18 years. You let them wonder if their son was still alive somewhere, if he might come home someday. I know. Harrison's response was barely a whisper. I know what I cost them, but I was selfish, and I was afraid. I'd already lost my son. I couldn't bear to lose everything else too. The waitress approached their table to offer coffee refills, but both Sarah and Harrison waved her away. The conversation they were having required privacy and couldn't be interrupted by the normal rhythms of civilian life. Harrison, Sarah said, her voice taking on the authority of the detective she'd once been. Where is Tommy's body? The former sheriff reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, a map with a location marked in red ink, 3 miles northeast of the bunker, near an old mining shaft that was sealed in the 1960s. We buried him there because we knew the area would never be developed, never be disturbed. Sarah took the map, studying the location. It was in a part of the forest that had been off-limits during the original search due to unstable ground conditions around the old mining operations. "This ends tonight," Sarah said. "Tomorrow morning I'm contacting the State Attorney General's office and turning over everything we've discovered. Tommy's parents deserve to know the truth, and they deserve to lay their son to rest properly." Harrison nodded, seeming almost relieved. "I know. I've been waiting for this day for 18 years. Part of me always hoped someone would be smart enough and determined enough to uncover what we'd done." "There's something else," Sarah said. "Someone else knew what happened. Someone documented everything and hid evidence in both the bunker and the Watchtower. Someone who wanted the truth to eventually come to light." Harrison looked genuinely puzzled. "I don't know who that could have been. Michael and I were the only ones who knew the full truth." Sarah considered the possibilities. Someone had been watching, documenting, preserving evidence for the future. Someone who'd known about the cover-up but had chosen to let it play out rather than expose it immediately. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest," Sarah said. "During the original investigation, did you suspect that someone else knew what had really happened?" Harrison thought carefully before answering. "There were times when I felt like we were being watched, like someone was paying too close attention to our activities. But I assumed it was just paranoia, guilt making me see threats that weren't there. Who had access to information about the investigation? Who knew details that weren't released to the public? The deputies working the case, the state investigators who assisted briefly, Dr. Whitman." Harrison paused. "And Mayor Patricia Hartwell." Sarah felt her world shift again. Patricia Hartwell, Tommy's mother, had been mayor of Cedar Valley during her son's disappearance. She'd had access to all the investigative reports, had been briefed on every development in the case. "You think Tommy's mother knew the truth?" "I think," Harrison said slowly, "that Patricia Hartwell was smarter than any of us gave her credit for. And I think she loved her son enough to be very, very patient in pursuing justice." The implications were staggering. If Patricia Hartwell had discovered the truth about her son's death, she might have spent 18 years carefully documenting evidence and waiting for the right moment to expose it. The metal containers, the hidden documents, they could be her insurance policy, her way of ensuring that someday, somehow, the truth would come to light. Standing at the crossroads between revelation and reckoning, you realize that some truths are worth waiting 18 years to uncover. But now that the confession has been made, the real work begins, finding Tommy's remains and giving his family the closure they've been denied for nearly 2 decades. The Mother's Gambit. Patricia Hartwell's house sat on a hill overlooking Cedar Valley, its Victorian architecture a testament to the town's more prosperous past. At 68, she moved with the measured grace of someone who'd learned to carry grief without letting it consume her. But Sarah could see the weight of 18 years in the careful way she arranged herself in the living room chair, the way her hands remained folded even when her emotions threatened to spill over. "I wondered when someone would finally put the pieces together," Patricia said after Sarah had explained about the bunker, the confession, and Harrison's admission. Her voice carried a strength that surprised Sarah, not the broken desperation of a mother still searching for answers, but the quiet confidence of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. The living room was a shrine to Tommy's memory, but not in the desperate way Sarah had expected. Photographs of the boy were displayed alongside images of the man he might have become, graduations he would have attended, birthdays he would have celebrated, the life that had been stolen from him. But there was something else in the room that caught Sarah's attention, a large filing cabinet with multiple locks, positioned where Patricia could see it from her favorite chair. "You knew," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Patricia smiled sadly. "I suspected within months of Tommy's disappearance. Too many inconsistencies in the official story, too many convenient gaps in the investigation, and William Harrison was never as good at lying as he thought he was." She rose from her chair and moved to the filing cabinet, producing a set of keys from a drawer in the antique writing desk nearby. When you've been mayor of a small town for over 2 decades, you learn to pay attention to details that others might miss. You also learn to be patient when pursuing justice. Patricia unlocked the filing cabinet and withdrew several thick folders, each meticulously labeled and organized. Sarah could see immediately that this wasn't the desperate collection of a grieving mother grasping at conspiracy theories. This was the methodical documentation of someone building a legal case. 3 months after Tommy disappeared, Patricia began, settling back into her chair with the folders in her lap. I hired a private investigator from Seattle, not to find Tommy. I already suspected he was dead, but to investigate the investigation itself. She opened the first folder, revealing photographs, documents, and detailed timeline analyses. Deputy Michael Harrison's patrol log showed gaps on the day Tommy disappeared. Gaps that coincided exactly with the time frame when Tommy would have been riding his bike through the forest. The official explanation was that Michael had been responding to reports of suspicious activity, but when I cross-referenced dispatch records, no such reports existed. Sarah leaned forward, studying the documents Patricia was displaying. The level of detail was extraordinary. Phone records, fuel receipts, even interviews with residents along Michael's patrol route that day. You documented everything. I documented everything I could access legally, Patricia corrected. As mayor, I had legitimate reasons to review certain aspects of the investigation. As a concerned citizen, I could hire private investigators to pursue other avenues. Sarah examined the photographs Patricia was showing her. Surveillance images taken from a distance that captured Michael Harrison's patrol car, at locations that didn't match his official reports. The timestamps were devastating. They placed him on the Forest Service Road at exactly the time Tommy would have been riding through the area. When did you build the documentation cache in the bunker and Watchtower? Patricia's expression grew somber. After Michael's suicide. When a deputy with direct knowledge of my son's case suddenly dies in a convenient accident, it became clear that evidence might start disappearing. I needed insurance. She opened another folder, revealing copies of documents that Sarah recognized. The same papers they'd found hidden in the Watchtower. I had help from someone in the sheriff's department who was also suspicious about how the investigation was being handled. Someone who believed that justice delayed wasn't justice denied, but justice deferred until the right moment. Who? Deputy Elena Rodriguez. She's retired now, living in Phoenix, but 18 years ago she was the only person in law enforcement I trusted completely. Elena helped me document everything and hide copies where they'd be safe until someone honest enough and determined enough came looking for the truth. Sarah remembered Elena Rodriguez, a dedicated officer who'd left Cedar Valley shortly after the Hartwell case was closed. She'd cited family reasons for relocating, but now Sarah wondered if Elena had simply lost faith in the system she'd sworn to serve. Patricia reached for the largest folder, its contents thick enough to represent years of careful investigation. The private investigator I hired didn't just document Michael Harrison's movements that day. He investigated the entire Harrison family, their finances, their connections. What he found was troubling. The folder contained bank records, property transfers, and financial documents that painted a picture of a family under significant economic pressure. Sheriff Harrison had been heavily invested in local real estate that had lost value during the economic downturns of the 1990s. His wife had accumulated substantial medical debt during a long battle with cancer that had ultimately claimed her life just months before Tommy's disappearance. Harrison was facing bankruptcy, Patricia continued. His pension wouldn't have been enough to cover his debts, and his reputation was the only thing standing between his family and financial ruin. When Michael caused Tommy's death, Harrison wasn't just protecting his son, he was protecting his own future. Sarah studied the financial records, seeing the desperation that must have driven Harrison's decisions. A man who'd built his identity around law and order had been forced to choose between justice and survival, and he'd chosen survival. "There's more," Patricia said, her voice taking on an edge that suggested they were approaching the heart of the matter. The private investigator discovered that Michael Harrison had been involved in other incidents that his father had covered up. A hit-and-run accident 6 months before Tommy's death where Michael had been drinking. An assault charge that mysteriously disappeared from the court records. A pattern of behavior that suggested Tommy's death wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. The full scope of the corruption was becoming clear. Sheriff Harrison hadn't just covered up one tragic accident. He'd been systematically protecting his son from the consequences of increasingly dangerous behavior. "Why didn't you come forward with this evidence?" Patricia's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Because I wanted more than justice. I wanted the whole truth. Every person who'd been complicit, every cover-up, every abuse of power that had made Tommy's death possible. And because I knew that if I moved too quickly, evidence would disappear and witnesses would suddenly develop convenient amnesia." She opened the final folder, revealing a document that made Sarah's breath catch. It was a detailed confession written in Michael Harrison's handwriting, photocopied and notarized. The confession Sheriff Harrison claimed to have destroyed. Elena Rodriguez retrieved this from Michael's patrol car before the official investigation of his accident began. Patricia explained. She made copies and gave the original to me. I've been waiting 18 years for the right moment to use it. Sarah read through Michael's confession, her heart breaking with each detail. The young deputy had documented everything: the drinking, the collision with Tommy, the panic that led to the cover-up, and the crushing guilt that had ultimately driven him to suicide. But the confession contained one detail that Harrison had omitted from his account at the diner. Tommy was conscious when they brought him to the bunker, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. For several hours, Patricia confirmed. According to Michael's confession, Tommy asked for his mother before he died. He asked to go home. The weight of that revelation settled over Sarah like a physical blow. Tommy had suffered not just from his injuries, but from the knowledge that he was dying far from home, far from the people who loved him. Patricia, Sarah said carefully, are you ready for this to become public? Once we turn this evidence over to the state attorney general, there's no going back. The whole story will come out. The cover-up, the corruption, everything that's been hidden for 18 years. Patricia Hartwell straightened in her chair, and for a moment Sarah could see the mayor she'd once been, the woman who'd led a community through crisis with strength and dignity. Detective Chen, I've been ready for 18 years. I've been waiting for someone like you to find the truth because I knew that when the time came, it had to be discovered by someone who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or silenced. Justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice perfected. As they prepared to package all the evidence for transport to the state capitol, Sarah's phone rang. Marcus's voice was tight with urgency. Sarah, you need to get back to the forest immediately. We've been excavating the site marked on Harrison's map, and we found Tommy's remains. But there's something else, something that changes everything we thought we knew about this case. Final revelations. The excavation site was lit by portable floodlights that cast stark shadows across the forest floor, creating an otherworldly scene where past and present intersected in harsh relief. Sarah arrived to find Dr. Eleanor Whitman kneeling beside a carefully exposed burial site, her trained hands working with archaeological precision to reveal secrets that had been hidden for 18 years. Tommy Hartwell's remains were small, heartbreakingly fragile, but they told a story that filled in the final gaps in a puzzle that had consumed multiple lives. Eleanor looked up as Sarah approached, her expression grim. The skeletal evidence confirms everything Harrison told you, Eleanor said. Severe head trauma consistent with vehicular impact, followed by medical neglect that would have been survivable with immediate treatment. But Sarah could see in Eleanor's posture that there was more to the story. What else did you find? Eleanor gestured to a collection of artifacts laid out on a tarp beside the gravesite. Among Tommy's personal effects, his torn jacket, the remains of his hiking boots, a small plastic toy he'd been carrying, was something that shouldn't have been there. A second sheriff's department badge, heavily corroded but still identifiable. It's not Michael Harrison's badge, Eleanor said. The number doesn't match, and the manufacturing date suggests it's from an earlier period. This badge was issued in the 1970s. Marcus joined them, his face pale in the artificial light. I ran the badge number through the department's historical records. It belonged to Deputy James Morrison, who died in the line of duty in 1982. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet once again. Morrison? I don't remember that name from any of the case files. Because his death was ruled an accident, Marcus continued. Single-car crash on the same stretch of Mountain Ridge Road where Michael Harrison died 16 years later. But according to the records, Morrison had been investigating financial irregularities in the department just before his death. Eleanor stood, brushing soil from her hands. The placement of this badge suggests it was deliberately buried with Tommy's body. Someone wanted it to be found eventually, wanted it to be connected to this case. Patricia Hartwell, Sarah realized. She knew about Morrison's death, knew there was a pattern of suspicious accidents involving deputies who asked too many questions. As they documented the excavation site, Sarah's understanding of the case expanded beyond the tragedy of one boy's death to encompass decades of corruption and cover-ups. Cedar Valley hadn't just failed Tommy Hartwell. It had been failing people for generations. Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text message that made her expression darken further. Sarah, we have a problem. The DNA analysis on some material we found in the bunker has come back. There's biological evidence from a second victim. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. If there was evidence of another victim, it meant Tommy's death might not have been an isolated incident. It meant they might be looking at a pattern of violence that had been concealed for decades. How long before we have full results? 24 hours for complete analysis. But the preliminary findings suggest the second victim was significantly older than Tommy, possibly an adult. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. Deputy Morrison, who'd died investigating financial irregularities. Other deputies or civilians who disappeared over the years. The scope of the conspiracy might be far larger than anyone had imagined. Marcus's radio crackled with an incoming transmission from the state police. Deputy Rivera, this is Detective Captain Lisa Torres from the State Attorney General's office. We're en route to your location with a full investigation team. Please secure the scene and ensure all evidence is preserved for state custody. Copy that, Marcus responded. The scene is secure, and all evidence has been documented according to protocol. As they waited for the state investigators to arrive, Sarah found herself thinking about the chain of events that had led them to this moment. Tommy's disappearance had been the catalyst, but the real story was about a community's failure to protect its most vulnerable members and the courage of those who'd refused to let injustice stand unchallenged. Eleanor approached with a final discovery that provided a fitting end to their investigation. Hidden in the inner pocket of Tommy's jacket, preserved by the plastic lining, was a small piece of paper with a child's handwriting. If something happens to me, check the bunker by the tower. Mr. Harrison knows where it is. Tommy knew, Sarah whispered. Somehow he knew he was in danger. Children often understand more than adults give them credit for, Eleanor replied. Tommy may have overheard conversations, seen things that didn't make sense at the time but that his instincts told him were dangerous. The state investigation team arrived just as dawn was breaking through the forest canopy, their professional efficiency a stark contrast to the emotional weight of the discoveries. Detective Captain Torres was a woman in her 50s, whose reputation for thorough, uncompromising investigations had made her a natural choice to handle sensitive cases involving law enforcement corruption. Detective Chen, Torres said as she surveyed the scene, I've read your preliminary report. This appears to be far more complex than a simple cover-up of a vehicular accident. Sarah handed over all the evidence they'd collected, the metal containers from the bunker and Watchtower, Patricia Hartwell's meticulously documented files, Sheriff Harrison's confession, and now the physical evidence from Tommy's burial site. Captain Torres, I believe we're looking at decades of corruption involving multiple deaths and cover-ups. This case is going to require resources that exceed anything a local investigation could provide. Torres nodded grimly. The Attorney General has already authorized a full task force. We'll be conducting a comprehensive review of every suspicious death, disappearance, and unsolved case in Cedar Valley, going back to 1980. If there's a pattern of criminal activity, we're going to find it. As the state team took custody of the evidence and began their own systematic documentation of the scene, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Tommy Hartwell would finally receive justice, but the cost had been enormous, not just to his family, but to an entire community that had lived under the shadow of corruption for decades. Patricia Hartwell arrived as Tommy's remains were being carefully prepared for transport to the State Forensics Laboratory. She moved through the scene with quiet dignity, saying goodbye to the son she'd lost 18 years ago and finally found again. He was a brave boy, Patricia said to Sarah as they stood together at the edge of the excavation site. Even at 8 years old, he understood that sometimes you have to stand up to people who abuse their power. I'm proud that he tried to document what he suspected, even though it cost him his life. As the investigation vehicles departed and the forest began to return to its natural quiet, Sarah found herself thinking about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. Tommy's case had consumed 18 years of her life, had driven her away from law enforcement, had haunted her dreams and shaped her understanding of justice. Sometimes the truth requires patience that spans decades, courage that endures through years of doubt, and faith that justice delayed can still be justice achieved. Tommy Hartwell's story was finally complete, but his legacy would be the comprehensive investigation that would ensure no other child in Cedar Valley would suffer the same fate. Epilogue. Justice served. 2 years after the discovery at the bunker, Cedar Valley had transformed from a community living in the shadow of unresolved tragedy to one confronting its past with courage and determination. The state attorney general's investigation had uncovered a network of corruption that extended far beyond Tommy Hartwell's death, resulting in posthumous charges against multiple deceased officials and the reopening of 17 cold cases dating back to 1982. Sarah Chen stood in the newly renovated town square, watching as Mayor Patricia Hartwell unveiled a memorial to Tommy and the other victims whose deaths had been concealed by those sworn to protect them. The bronze statue depicted a young boy with a backpack and hiking boots, looking toward the forest with the fearless curiosity that had defined Tommy's short life. Dr. Eleanor Whitman had accepted a position as the director of the Cedar Valley Criminal Justice Institute, a new organization dedicated to training law enforcement professionals in ethical investigation techniques and community accountability. The institute was housed in a building funded by the settlement the state had paid to the families of corruption victims. Marcus Rivera had been elected sheriff in a special election, running on a platform of transparency and community trust. At 37, he represented a new generation of law enforcement leaders committed to earning rather than demanding respect from the communities they served. The old Watchtower had been converted into a memorial site where visitors could learn about the importance of speaking truth to power and the courage required to pursue justice even when it seemed impossible. A plaque at the base of the tower bore Tommy's own words, "If something happens to me, check the bunker by the tower." As the memorial ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself walking toward the forest trail that led to the former bunker site. The concrete structure had been removed, and in its place grew a small grove of oak trees, one for each victim whose truth had been hidden in Cedar Valley's dark history. At the center of the grove stood a simple bench where Patricia Hartwell often came to sit and remember her son. Today, she was there waiting for Sarah, her face peaceful in a way that had seemed impossible 2 years ago. "He would have been 26 today," Patricia said as Sarah joined her on the bench. "Old enough to have children of his own, old enough to be making his mark on the world." "He did make his mark," Sarah replied. "His courage in trying to document what he suspected, your courage in preserving the truth, and everyone who refused to give up. Tommy changed this town permanently." Patricia smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Sarah had ever seen on her face. "The investigators found 7 more victims, Sarah. 7 people whose families never knew what really happened to them. Tommy's story gave voice to all of them." As the afternoon sun filtered through the oak leaves above them, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. Justice had required 18 years of patience, but it had finally arrived not just for Tommy Hartwell, but for an entire community that had been living with the consequences of unchecked corruption. The forest around them hummed with life, birds calling to each other through the canopy, small animals rustling through the undergrowth, the eternal cycle of growth and renewal that had witnessed both tragedy and triumph in these woods. Cedar Valley would continue to change and grow, but it would do so with the knowledge that truth, however long delayed, would eventually find its way to the light. In the end, Tommy Hartwell's legacy wasn't just the exposure of corruption or the reform of institutions. It was the reminder that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important truths. Justice may be delayed, but for those with the patience to pursue it and the courage to demand it, justice will ultimately prevail.